Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. I see there are quite a few of you already here. I just got rid of the echo, so if you were hearing one, I don't think you should be hearing it any longer. Let me give a few shout outs before I start. Hi, Dolores. Hey, Rob. How you doing? Hey, Dale. Hi, Lana. Avromano. Greetings. Finally got to use the phone tonight. I'm glad you did, Avro. Amberly, how you doing tonight? Kay, hope you're well. Hi, Sandy. Avril says, just read Twitter fact checks Trump. Looks like people starting to stand up to his fascist ways. Well, Twitter didn't want to throw him off or delete those offensive tweets he had just yesterday. Avril says, I do hear some distortion. Do you still hear it? It must be my device. Does anybody else hear any distortion? If all is good, I'm going to start. Okay, so what I want to talk about tonight is that as time has gone on and we see the actions Congress has been taking, we all can see that most of what they've been doing has either been completely ineffective or has been going to bail out extremely large corporations. And Trump, okay, and McConnell are now talking about some more tax cuts that won't do anything about the problem of the economy and stimulating the economy in time to avert a depression. Furthermore, the help they've given to most people has been very small, the $1,200 stimulus checks and the unemployment insurance, which money is starting to flow, but have not gone as yet to nearly as many people as was intended at first. But those two things are enabling some people to pay their rent and buy food and to avert a total collapse. But at the same time, the unemployment insurance expansion, the extra $600 a week, is due to expire at the end of the next 2 months. I believe it's the end of July. And Mitch McConnell, of course, is saying no further relief, is needed. And Nancy Pelosi has proposed another relief bill that puts absolutely no pressure on Mitch McConnell and on the Republicans, because that bill contains very little help for most people. It contains, in addition to the small business program, which potentially is good, and the other thing it contains is something McConnell doesn't want to act on, which is aid to states. There is $1 trillion in there, in aid to states. That looks like it could be very, very important if it were passed. And we'll see why, in just a few minutes. But with Mitch McConnell saying, we don't want to have any relief for states. And why not? Because the progressives and the Democrats lost their leverage when they voted for the CARES Act, which, as you know, shot a money cannon at the wealthy with a $4.6 trillion loan on the trust fund for corporations to feed on. I shouldn't say trust fund, it's a slush fund, it's a loan fund. And the purpose of it is to give corporations access to money with very few questions asked. And evidently, one of its purposes is, as far as anybody can tell, is to give them the necessary money to consolidate our economy still further in an oligarchical fashion in just a relatively few firms, in order to exacerbate the inequality situation and to deliver more control into the hands of the wealthy and the corporations they own or they control. So Avril asked the question, what happened with the ABC Act? It hasn't been online. Nothing has happened with the ABC Act. It didn't get to first base, in Nancy Pelosi's relief bill, and there's been very little pressure for it on the part of the leadership of the Democratic Party. It hasn't been picked up in the Senate. What Bernie Sanders did is he put in his own bill to give people $2,000 a month. But, and that's a good bill. But he avoids the question of how you're going to pay for it, which is made very, very explicit in the ABC Act, and which is one of the best features of that particular act. So, The ABC Act has not gone anywhere right now. And also, Bernie's bill is not going anywhere right now either. And the Democrats and the progressives are currently divided on which bill they want to support. And the Paycheck Guarantee Act, of Jayapal, which is another very important bill, especially to keep the people tied to employers, at this point, also has not gotten into first base. And of course, nothing is being done to give people Medicare for all during the period of the pandemic. And that's a very, very important thing, too, which is getting no attention and no pressure right now because Nancy Pelosi has put in her relief bill support for extensions of CORBA. So basically saying, that government would pay people's costs. I'm sorry, not for CORBA, for COBRA, so that they could extend their employer-based insurance, so they won't either lose that or have to pay for that on their own for the duration of the crisis. So that's better than nothing, but it's primarily not a bailout of healthcare for people as much as it is a bailout for the insurance companies that when people get fired from their jobs and they don't sign up to COBRA, then the insurance companies don't get anything. So Pelosi has obviously been trying to bail out the insurance companies, not caring so much about actually bailing the people out. So McKay says, and it seems like that, Dems are planning, on losing this election, I think. Seems to me both parties are planning on losing the election. It seems to me Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, as polling data keeps on coming in and keeps on showing that they're more and more trouble in the Senate, the Democrats have a chance now to flip not just 4 seats they need, take over control of the Senate, but there are 8 or 9 seats where the Republicans are looking extremely weak, which the Democrats might be able to flip. And they'd have a very good chance of flipping those seats if they were running on a decent platform, if they didn't have to contend with Nancy Pelosi's shenanigans in the House and with the passivity of Chuck Schumer in the Senate. So it seems to me Mitch McConnell's actions are extremely unpopular in the country as a whole, and he's being challenged in his state by a Democratic candidate who's a very weak candidate in terms of her appeal in Kentucky, and yet she's running even with Mitch right now, even though Mitch's popularity numbers are now somewhere in the 30s or something like that. He's extremely unpopular, and most probably people would like to vote for somebody else, but the Democrats refuse to approve somebody decent. So, why is this the case? Why is the political situation looking so bad? Well, of course, there's COVID-19 and the very poor response of the United States to the healthcare aspects of COVID-19. And last night, I went over just how poor the performance of the United States is compared to, say, Taiwan, or compared to Japan, or compared to South Korea, or compared to Hong Kong, or Australia, or New Zealand, just compared to a host of countries that have jumped on this and are doing a good job. And we're sitting there at 300 fatalities per million. By the way, according to one of the COVID trackers that I look at, we didn't quite make it to 100,000. But yesterday, by this morning, we were at 99,905. So uh, we're in the process tonight, I think, of going over the 100,000 fatalities. Of course, the beaches and some of the other swimming places in the states reopened for the weekend. And we saw in some places that people were social distancing, and that was nice to see. And they were being fairly careful, but in other places, they were not social distancing, and they were getting so close to each other that we know that within 2 weeks or so, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to start seeing many new cases, and we may start seeing new fatalities. In other words, the fatality curve may start to go up again within only 2 or 3 weeks from now as a result of the reopening gathering steam. Some states are reopening very cautiously. For example, New Jersey still is being very, very careful because they know they're on the cusp of something even more serious. In Jersey, they've been very high in deaths per million, not as high as New York, but very, very worrisome. Why? Because the areas around the city in New Jersey have very high rates because the people go into Jersey to work. And in many cases, they still do, especially the suburbanites are not people who have the kinds of laboring jobs that get them to go into New York City. They have they have jobs in the financial sector and in the marketing sector and in various kinds of cave management, and they live out in the suburbs, and they commute into New York City every day, and they put themselves in danger by commuting, okay, and by being in offices, and it's not enough to protect them. As many of them stay home as they possibly can, of course, and many of them can work, okay, in a remote way, but still, they're exposed, and the virus has spread. And so their fatalities per million are very high, okay, in Jersey. They not only have to worry about what's coming out of New York to them, but also what's coming out of Philadelphia. And then they have their own spread problems, okay, in Newark, okay, as well. So that state is going to continue to have some problems. And the governor, very sensibly, is being very careful about how and what he reopens and how and what he allows. Okay. But anyway, so there was one thing I wanted to take note of, which appeared in Truth Out, which relates to COVID and specifically what it's like for frontline workers. And it's quite a striking article. I've linked to it and I commend it to you. The title of it is I'm a Frontline Medical Worker. I contracted COVID and it took my grandfather. And here's a young man and his grandfather. And the young man's name is Zaki uh, uh, Azam. And this photo is of him graduating from medical school. I'm going to share that with you now. is quite striking. Okay, and you can see their faces there with Zaki. Okay, and his grandfather Mohammed Khan. Their name is Khan. There's a good chance they're from Pakistan, or the family is originally from Pakistan. It could very well be that Zaki was born here. And there's a picture of his grandfather at that happy time of celebrating his graduation from medical school at their home in Long Island in 2000, okay, in 19. And the article is by Zaki Azam. And he tells the story of the voice that echoes in his head. It's the voice that blares overhead every few seconds in my workplace, indicating where to go for yet another cardiac arrest or another patient on the verge of death. And Zaki is a first-year internal medicine resident in New York City. And he talks about the physical, okay, and emotional toll that he has suffered. He says that his attending physician reminds him of someone commanding a battlefield. He's surrounded by allied residents, doctors who had chosen different specialties but are now deployed to my floor, and coalition doctors, students who graduated early to help us. Because, of course, the crisis, they ran short, gave doctors, so they graduated some students early so they could help. The regular hospital terminology has been replaced by wartime rhetoric. Unlike soldiers in war, however, none of us ever expected to lose our lives by practicing our chosen profession. But our chosen profession, which of course is the medical profession. Being on the front line of a global pandemic at a tertiary care center in one of the most populated cities in the world, and by the way, a city that has not handled COVID-19 very well, is surreal and scary. Till I came down with COVID-19 myself, I was scared of potential cases I was coming into contact with, scared that my mask wasn't fitting properly on my face, and scared that I would touch it with dirty gloves by mistake. My face hurt from wearing a mask 13 hours a day. My head hurt from trying to find a mask in the chaos of people frantically searching for them. Walking into a shift one morning, I was handed a Yankees poncho to use as a gown. Quote, "Treat it like gold," unquote, one hospital administrator said at a weekly COVID town hall conference. I feared for my life. As the death toll began to spike, I started taking a few seconds out of my day just to hold my patients' hands as they neared death. I closed my eyes and stood in silence, remembering each patient. I reminded myself that tomorrow is never promised. A few mornings later, I started having fever and chills. I was in stern denial, but in reality, this should not have been a surprise. I was given a Yankees poncho and sent to war. And I began to hear my 84-year-old grandfather, whom I live with, coughing violently. What's his oxygen saturation? How's his breathing? These are questions I'd asked about strangers a few weeks ago. Now I was asking them about my grandfather as I brought him to the ER. And there is his grandfather again, this time with glasses on, and his grandmother. My grandfather taught me what true love and compassion looks like. He writes, adding that in this photo, his grandfather with my grandmother on a surprise 73rd birthday together at a restaurant. One of the horrors of being in the hospital during this time is that no family members are able to be by your side. Meanwhile, in New York, the medical workers are stretched so thin that there are not enough to look after everyone. The care for each patient inevitably becomes compromised. One morning, as I was doing my daily checks on my grandfather, I noticed that he was far less alert and responsive. I couldn't shield him from the hospital any longer. Day after day, as my grandfather remained in the hospital, I saw him through FaceTime. Truthfully, I felt blessed to be able to see him at all. I got to see him and he got to see me, even if it was through a 5-inch screen. It was our lifeline. It was also through this screen that I noticed my grandfather's sudden change in breathing one day, and no one within reach. I called out, uh, uh, rapid response, unquote, as loud as I could into my phone. Undoubtedly, my first over FaceTime. The truth of the matter is, much of the care that patients receive during this time falls into the already overburdened hands of the people taking care of them. Most patients are lucky if the providers enter their room without feeling the immediate need to rush out. One of the calls we dread making as doctors is telling a family member their loved one is dying. That was the call I received when my grandfather's oxygen levels were dropping. We go accustomed to making the call as by clinicians, but we never expect to get it ourselves. I rushed to the hospital. I felt for his pulse, slow but faint. As a doctor, you become desensitized over time. You frantically think of the next steps that will save a body's life until you realize that body is someone you know. The physician inside me took a pause, and the human inside me I can't go on reading this. So I'll skip that particular paragraph. At the time of his grandfather's death was 3:12 p.m. He points out that death during this time has no dignity, that patients die scared. Talks about how he headed back to work. He thought about all the patients he treated before he knew that his grandfather would be stricken with the disease. Okay, so I can't go on and read this to you. Okay, I just have to recommend it very, very highly because it makes these 100,000 deaths seem very, very personal. And that is the way to remember that there have been 100,000 deaths, and that there are many more to come. There are many more to come because incompetence of this government, our leaders, and our legislators. And all I can say, as I've said a number of times before, is we must get rid of them, as many of them as we can. More Republicans than Democrats. One has to say that. Because the Republicans, taken as a whole, as a party, individual by individual, are just so much worse. But the leadership of the Democratic Party and many of the people who follow them are just as bad. Avromano says, neoliberal murderers. And I think that's right. I don't think it's too harsh to call them that. I often don't do that. I don't do that, okay, in anger. But I've said, as many, many others have said, government austerity is murder. And that's what's behind this. That's what led to Trump. That's what led to the lack of readiness to meet this particular pandemic. That's what led to the tragedy that Zaki and his grandfather suffered, and to the tragedies, okay, that many of us are suffering and will suffer. We've talked here about general strikes, and we've talked about the movement for a general strike and Eric Kilbloss's work in trying to get a general strike actually going. At this point, we need actions like that. We can't just wait for the election. Our opportunity to do something in the primaries seems to be gone. One of the things that was covered earlier today is that in spite of everything, that still 40% of the delegates that have so far been selected for the Democratic Party are delegates pledged to Bernie Sanders. And Joe Biden still is lacking a nomination. Of course, he continues to run into trouble. He continues to perform very, very poorly in how he is running. He continues not to advocate for the kinds of policies we need. He continues to adhere to policies and to principles which won't change anything for us, which will probably leave us unprepared for the next pandemic. Just unprepared. So, let me take another tack at this that helps to explain what has happened and why we're on the cusp of a depression. And then I will get more specific. Here again is the unsanitized column from the American by Prospect at prospect.org. The regular columnist for this is the editor of the Prospect, Dave Badayan. But on weekends, on Sundays, he is now bringing in a guest columnist. And his guest columnist on May 24th was Gautam Mukunda. And the title of his column was Unsanitized Republicans, Predators, and the Pandemic. And there's a picture of, can't remember if this is David or Charles. It's Charles. Okay, the live one. Okay. Okay, Gautam is a research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for Public Leadership and the author of Indispensable When Leaders Really Matter. And his Twitter handle is there, and you can follow him there. Spurred on by President Trump, Republican governors are reopening their states. In other states, protests against the lockdown roll on, even as the country hits new highs in daily deaths. Despite the economic devastation, however, 80% of Americans still support shelter-in-place measures. Even among the Republicans, let me share this. I'm neglecting my sharing once again. So let me share this one so you can see it too. In other states, the protests against the lockdown roll on even as the country hits new highs in daily deaths. Despite the economic devastation, however, 80% of Americans still support shelter-in-place measures. Even among Republicans, 61% support shelter-in-place and 47% oppose the protests, while only 36% support them. And I'll add a comment here to the column. It's apparent that what Trump is doing in trying to reopen is he's taking a gamble, a very large gamble. He probably knows that if things keep on going as they have been going, that he'll be voted out of office due to simply the blame for all this, the economic devastation and the daily deaths as well. So, as we know, Trump is a gambler, and what he's decided to gamble on is that the deaths are likely to be reduced, but during the summertime, that the progress of COVID is likely to be slowed, that the slowdown may last until all the way through October. And that meanwhile, we will have a recovery in the economy that is quick. He's gambling that it will be quick, and that therefore, as we get through August, as we get through September, that his poll numbers are going to start to go up, that people will forget about the 100,000 or more fatalities. Oh, and by the way, it's almost certain now that the real fatality figure is 130,000, and that we'll see that when they get a better handle on those who have not yet been counted. But anyway, Trump hopes that people will see that as being in the past because of the slowdown of COVID. And if he gets a really brilliant economy supported strongly by the very rich companies he's given so much to, that he will look better in the fall than Joe Biden, and that he will be able to beat him. So he knows what these poll figures are right now. He knows that 80% of Americans still support the shelter-in-place measures. He knows 61% of the Republicans are supporting shelter in place. He hopes that is not the direction of things to come, and he's gambling. Okay, so Gautam goes on. The experts are on the same page. Economists, virologists, and epidemiologists all say that easing the lockdowns before the virus is under control would have disastrous consequences. But while the experts and the public, Republicans included, are overwhelmingly on one side of the issue, many Republican office holders, including President Trump, are on the other. It is rare, to put it very mildly, for politicians to take positions opposed by most Americans, particularly those of their own party, on a subject of immense public interest. I don't see how Gautam can say that. It is not rare. We have Nancy Pelosi opposing Medicare for all when 2/3 of Americans are for it, and when 88% of the Democratic Party voters polled are for it, and she opposes it and tells people you will never get Medicare for all. And implicitly is saying, as long as I'm here, you're never going to get Medicare for all. And then there's Joe Biden, who again is opposing 88% of Democrats. So I don't think it's rare. Green New Deal probably has majority support among Democrats right now. And is going to get increasingly popular. And yet clearly, the mainstream of the party has not yet really taken it up, and is not particularly fond of the idea. Both parties are inhabited and right now controlled by leaders who don't give a damn what the people think, but only care about what the donors think. And of course, it takes a scholar from the Harvard Center for Leadership, or whatever it's called, to come out and say it is rare, to put it mildly, for politicians to take positions opposed by most Americans, particularly those of their own party, on a subject of immense public interest. I don't think it's rare. That's the unfortunate part. That's what's wrong with our democracy. That's what makes it not a democracy anymore. Anyway, Time goes on. To understand why we need to know where the support for ending the lockdown comes from, to understand why we need to know where the support for ending the lockdown comes from and its roots in a profound flaw in the American economy. And he goes on to point out much of the pressure to immediately end the lockdown stems from a relatively small group of Republican financial elites. Yeah, a relatively small group of major donors. The president's initial proclamation to reopen the economy by Easter was spurred in part by a widely reported call with prominent investors. As well, the protests against governors' shelters in place and social distancing orders have been quietly supported by major conservative donors like Charles Koch. But not all billionaires are minimizing the dangers of the virus. Bill Gates, for example, was a prophetic voice warning against the danger of the pandemic and has continued to make the case for a forceful national response. He's far from alone. So why are the open it up? Who are the open it up? The mega rich, and why are they so powerful? Okay, Bill Gates, for example, doesn't come out there and say that he's for Medicare for all and he's for a Green New Deal. And he has not been notable for funding candidates who are for those particular things. So Bill Gates might have been a prophetic warning concerning the danger, of a pandemic. But he wasn't there. He wasn't there to politicize that particular warning and support candidates who were likely to do something about it, was he? Going further, and this is why I thought this column was worth actually coming to. There are two ways to make a great fortune. The first is creation, generating value and capturing a disproportionate share of it. We might criticize their tactics or business practices, but most Americans feel that Microsoft, Apple, and Google have greatly benefited America and that we should have many more companies like them. Oh, God. You can't have many more companies like them because they're dominating. They're dominating the commanding heights of the economy. They're concentrated. They're semi-monopolies. We don't need many more companies like them. Anyway, he's getting to the two ways. Well, actually, he said the first way is creation, generating value and capturing a disproportionate share of it. They did that. But what he's not saying is that Microsoft and Apple and Google, okay, and Amazon, who many people also think have greatly benefited America, that those companies and other big companies like them, Oracle, for example, have engaged in the second and sadly easier way to become stratospherically wealthy, however, which is predation. Instead of creating wealth, you capture it from others, leaving them and society as a whole worse off. If you inherit an oil company and build it into a giant, it might be an impressive business achievement. But when you use a tiny fraction of that wealth to weaken environmental regulations, then take advantage of them to drive up your profits, you're not creating wealth. You're just imposing costs, okay, on everyone else. And if Gautam thinks that Microsoft and Apple and Google have not been predatory, he's missing a big part of the picture of why those companies are so large today. It has not been only about creation. It's been about co-opting the competition. It's been about driving the competition out of business. Everybody who knows the IT field knows that's what's happened. But he's right about the two ways. You can create wealth and you can be predatory. I just want to be real here. The Microsofts, the Apples, the Googles, the Oracles, they have been predatory, and most of their wealth comes from their being predatory. They say, or he says, Gautam says, if you buy companies, load them up with debt to pay yourself huge fees, strip their assets, and then leave their workers unemployed with worthless pensions, the only thing you're creating is suffering, but you will get rich. He's right about that. And I don't think that Microsoft and Apple and Google have done that to their credit. They might have bought up, okay, a lot of other companies and crushed their competition in highly monopolistic ways, but they have not left workers unemployed with worthless pensions. And they have not stripped the assets of those companies in the same way Donald Trump has, for example. And if, like Trump, you inherit a real estate company, you illegally dodge taxes, you scam your customers and refuse to pay your contractors, then you've won predation bingo. I like that one, predation bingo. And then he talks about Peter Drucker on the one hand, and Drucker saying, the only purpose of business is to create a customer. In contrast to Milton Friedman, who said, quote, only one social responsibility of business is to increase its profits, unquote. That wasn't what Herbert Simon said. Anyway, Gautam goes on. You create customers by filling their needs, so both you and they are better off. Profits, however, can just as easily, all too often more easily, be increased through predation. Unfortunately, it was Friedman's ideas, rather than Drucker's, that came to dominate the way businesses were run, creating enormous fortunes for executives, while making it easy for them to think of most Americans as prey. What's more, the predators have realized their best return on investment comes from spending on politics, particularly on Mitch McConnell's money driven Republican Party. Well, there are a lot of them who think that very good returns on investment can also be gotten from the leaders of the Democratic Party, like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in the Congress. We see this in the titanic power of conservative billionaires like the Kochs, Sheldon Adelson, and the Mercers. When your fortune is in the billions, spending tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to lower your taxes, is a bargain. What Republican donors want is often very different from what Republican voters do, as the polling on sheltering in place makes clear. Indeed, as the Republican Party became dependent on predatory capitalists, it followed their preferences to such an extent that with 2 years of unified control of the government from 2017-2019, the only significant bill it passed was a giant tax cut for the wealthy, even though a Fox News poll found that 54% of Republican voters support raising taxes on people with incomes over 1 million. In this administration, the predators aren't just behind the scenes, they're center stage. There's Trump, but there's also Mnuchin, who made hundreds of millions expediting foreclosures, even though his company took $1.2 billion from government to help homeowners avoid them. And he fails to say here, even though his company took $1.2 billion, but also that he expedited foreclosures with robo signings. His company was one of the worst offenders when it came to robo signings. And Kamala Harris, who's reputed to be perhaps the leading candidate that Joe Biden might pick for vice president, she is the one who failed to prosecute Mnuchin, perhaps convict him, and make it impossible for him to be one of the major predators in this Trump government now. But we don't hear that from the Harvard Center guy. From the government to help homeowners avoid them, and Jared Kushner, who made millions as a slumlord, who refused to maintain apartments and gouged residents on fees. Jared Kushner, the holy religious Orthodox Jew. Okay, I say that as a Jew myself, but not an Orthodox one. But Kushner comes from a family who has made much of their religion for a very long time, and who have across generations behaved unethically and even criminally. So why are some Republicans pushing to reopen immediately? And I should add, Kushner is right now doing all he can to make life as tough as possible for the Palestinians, and has been instrumental in this administration's continuing to deny the Palestinians their rights, and in supporting the terribly reactionary Israeli regime in its quest to make any meaningful Palestinian statehood impossible. So why are some Republicans pushing to reopen immediately, even though the CDC predicts that this would result in deaths from the virus rising to more than 3,000 per day by June 1st? Why is Trump using the? I don't think, by the way, that it's going to rise. In other words, it is a few days short of June 1st. And I think we've been running something like 1,300 a day or 1,400 a day. It won't go up to 3,000 per day by June 1st. Okay, this column was written, I think, some time ago. Why is Trump using the Defense Production Act to force meat packing workers to labor in unsafe plants while refusing to use the power it grants him to increase the supply of personal protective equipment? Why is McConnell trying to give companies immunity from lawsuits if they violate workplace safety rules and get their employees sick? Why did Republican senators slip $170 billion tax break into the CARES Act that will provide more than 80% of its benefits, more than 1.6 million each, to wealthy real estate investors? And the answer, because they need the predators. When you're a predator, the calculation of when to reopen the economy looks very different than it does to most of us. In the absence of a vaccine or a treatment, COVID-19, unchecked by social distancing, will likely kill hundreds of thousands of Americans. But for a predator, sacrificing other people to maximize your wealth is the way you got rich in the first place. And he says, when predators go unchecked, however, the system, beginning with its legitimacy, can buckle. In 2009, Obama told the CEOs of major banks, quote, "My administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks," unquote. And he was trying to persuade them to limit what they were paying their top executives, including themselves, after being bailed out by American taxpayers. The Obama administration kept the pitchforks at bay, but its fundamental message that the American people would not much longer accept a mutant strain of capitalism in which a few gained stratospheric wealth by immiserating many remained unheard. Then he says, today's trade-off is even starker. The details of the global financial system are hard for almost anyone to understand, but it takes no special skill to see that a relative handful of billionaires are using their influence over the Republican Party to end the lockdown with scant regard for the ensuing cost in human life. Beating the virus and creating a nation where we are citizens, not prey, requires us to reject their influence and remove from power the politicians who do their bidding. Votes, not pitchforks, are the weapons we have to wield. Well, I thought there was much that was good, okay, in this article, especially the emphasis on the predatory strain, okay, of capitalism and its connection to the donors. Having said that, this is basically things that we already know about, but it's good to be reminded that it's the donors, it's the predatory donors and their influence on policy through the Republican Party, which is very important. But we also have to go beyond this piece to recognize that the predatory capitalists are also extremely influential in the Democratic Party and are the reason why but Nancy Pelosi, instead of trying to see to it that people have medical care during the crisis, the reason why, which she has not gone to Medicare for all in this crisis, but instead has gone to a costly proposal to pay the COBRA fees of people who have who have no jobs anymore, who were laid off, okay, from their jobs. The reason why she went there, the reason why she wanted to do right by the insurance companies was because of the influence of the predatory donors from the insurance companies and from the healthcare sector and from the banks. And the reason why she hasn't gone to direct income support for people in this crisis and why she hasn't gone for a job guarantee program in this crisis is because of the influence of the predatory financial people, the donors who supported most of the candidates for president by this year and who support most of her centrists and who support herself and who support Chuck Schumer. So Gautam has ignored this. It's a biased piece. It doesn't talk about the influence, okay, of the predators on the Democratic Party. So let's go now more quickly, but I will share it. I see you're still here, so I must be holding your interest. That's good. And thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your enthusiasm for what I'm doing here. This one was Dave Dayen's column for May 25th. It's the unsanitized column again. And the title of it, Kay, is Unmemorial Day. Unmemorial Day. And he gives a little bit of a personal twist to this. He learned that Ward Harkavy, a longtime editor for alternate publications, specifically weeklies like the Denver Westward and the Village Voice, died from COVID-19. Now, Dave did not know Ward, but he was familiar with his name, which would pop up in his Twitter feed from time to time. He knew that Ward's friends and colleagues spoke highly of him as a take-no-bullshit type, okay, newspaper man, born in Oklahoma, okay, a mentor to many writers and a pretty damn good one on his own. Dave says, I only interacted with him a handful of times as part of the social media blur. I wish I'd gotten to know him. And then Dave points out that there are just about 100,000 people like this in America. And if we're honest about the undercounted numbers served up by state and local governments, many more than that, they're casualties of the nation's largest mass death event since World War II that will likely pass the World War I death toll sometime in June. He says, I feel like I've heard the personal life stories of everyone who died. Of everyone who died on 9/11. There's an enormous wall in Washington with the names of every casualty of the Vietnam War. Go to many cities in this country and you'll see a similar memorial for the local soldiers who died in prior wars. It says, I don't know whether there will be a wall constructed for the victims of of the coronavirus, or if we'll ever get more than a cursory reflection on whom we've lost. More than a one-line tribute and an obit in the back of a dead tree newspaper. I do know that we've utterly failed to this point at showing any semblance, of honor. And he says this day is intended to mark the dead. Over the weekend, I had occasion to pass the federal building in West Los Angeles and the nearby sprawling VA campus. Both locations flew flags at half-staff because the political leadership belatedly decided that it would be a good time to take note of those lost from an unfolding tragedy that most of us have decided to suppress. On Tuesday, those flags will go back up, and we'll go back to failing the dead. He says, I count myself among the failed. We have been doing this unsanitized report for 2.5 months. I've diligently chronicled the economic fallout of the crisis, the extreme damage unfolding for workers, for renters and mortgage borrowers, for the millions finding themselves newly jobless. That economic depression will play out for years and touch many more lives than the coronavirus snuffed out. And I've chronicled the public health, the disaster, the pressure mounting at hospitals, the need to transport equipment. I've talked about the dead in aggregate, back when we hit 50,000 deaths last month. I even asked for and received your stories of the victims you knew and how you remembered them. He says, I haven't done enough. The dead have piled up so fast, it became impossible to make sense of and personalize the tragedy day by day, outside of a few musicians and actors and notable people. We aren't actually memorializing the husbands and wives, mothers and grandmothers, doctors and nurses, and patients, old and young, who have passed on. The lack of more than a pro forma utterance from the President of the United States about the loss of life is beyond despicable. But sadly, we're all kind of numb. This time of contagion has postponed most funeral services, most public expressions of grief. People are dying alone and head to their resting place alone. New York City initially enlisted prisoners to bury its dead on Hart's Island temporarily. Public outcry led to the end of the prison labor, but not the burying. The New York Times about the mini portraits of 1/100th of the fallen. That is the piece they had covering 1,000 of the victims over the weekend, was as incomplete as it was solemn. The only thing we're experiencing together as Americans is Zoom, not actual mourning. We're having national rallies about whether we can get back to having brunch again, and we're looking down our nose at those congregating at beaches and pools. We fight about the numbers, but we don't consider the humans behind them. We aren't thinking about those who died, and maybe it's too horrible to think about. Maybe the lack of physical evidence of death outside of the sirens that haunt me when I hear them periodically in Los Angeles is abstracting away from the suffering, the way that censored photos of flag-draped caskets during the height of the Iraq War abstracted away the pain onto Gold Star mothers and the narrow slice of Americans chosen to sacrifice. Maybe we're wrapped up in our personal turmoil, the burdens, financial and social, getting crabby about staying at home. Maybe we haven't seen 100,000 deaths in 3 months and don't know what to say or do about it. We turn away to other important side effects, and those will matter too. Maybe to a historic degree if the nation slides into depression. Preventing more deaths can take on more significance, and the steps to doing so, but both medicinal and procedural, with contact tracing and isolating and treatments complementing one another, must be studied, okay, and analyzed. But without keeping the dead atop our thoughts, we're just transferring political fights to the crisis. The reason we've obliterated our economy and upended our lives is because people like Ward, Harkavy, 100,000 people like him are dying from a contagious respiratory disease, and many more will die, and we should say their names and salute their lives, but once in a while. Sorry, folks, it's an emotional night for me. And yet another column by Dave. This one from today, May 26th. The title of it is A Few Weeks to Stop a Depression. It's another unsanitized column. Okay. And I'll share that one too. And this will bring us to the total overall point of my live stream tonight. So don't despair. We will get there. But we have to go through the background of the crisis first and its human meaning thus far. Because the way the Congress is behaving, there is a lot more human meaning to come. This is a photo of the Illinois legislature. See, they're meeting and they've social distance and they're wearing masks. They held their budget session in an arena in Springfield, Illinois, because of COVID-19. The final budget they passed relies on $5 billion in borrowing from the Federal Reserve. What happens if something happens and they're not able to borrow the $5 billion from the Federal Reserve at practically zero interest? Well, it's going to be a disaster for the people of that state. Case starts. We're back from a holiday weekend, but the Senate is still out of session, having left Washington without acting on more economic aid. The official line from Republicans is that it's time to see how previous efforts work before considering more. And anyway, the economy is opening back up. Maybe it won't need federal support. And Dave says, this is a dangerously wrong attitude, especially because of the realities of the political calendar. Decisions will be made in the next few weeks that will put the nation on a direct path to depression without congressional intervention. He alluded to that before in the earlier column, right? That's because, excuse me just a moment. Don't worry, I don't have COVID-19. That's not from a cold. That's because the fiscal year for many states begins on July 1st, and budgets must be adopted between now and then. California has a June 15th deadline for how to fill its giant budget hole, which could be as much as $54 billion. Other states scheduled to adopt a budget with this period include Colorado, Delaware, Georgia, Iowa, Kansas, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, also Michigan, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, Vermont, and Wisconsin. Nevada, like many states, has a biennial budget process. It will need a special session to cover shortfalls for this and the next fiscal year. The whole is about $1 billion for this year and more starting July 1st. Ohio has a similar size problem. Oregon expects a $3 billion dip in revenues for its 2-year budget. New Jersey moved its budget deadline from July 1st to September 1st, but has already planned on $1.3 billion in cuts, just a down payment on dealing with revenue losses of $10 billion. The budget, just to get to September, quote, includes potentially laying off educators, firefighters, police, EMS, and healthcare workers, Governor Phil Murphy told CNN. Similar carnage is everywhere. North Carolina expects a $4.2 billion shortfall. There are $3 to $4 billion in cuts needed in Georgia. It could be more than $10 billion in Florida. Indiana has asked for a 15% cut for most agencies for the next fiscal year, which also begins July 1st. Texas has started with a proposed 5% cut. Pennsylvania is concerned that an extension to tax filing delays revenue from 2019 filers until after the budget deadline, making forecasting impossible. There will be gimmicks that attempt to make things more palatable. Over the weekend, Illinois approved a budget that requires $5 billion in borrowing from the Federal Reserve's the municipal liquidity facility of the Federal Reserve, which I believe is about maybe a $350 billion facility. I don't think it's enough to cover all that we're talking about here. Something the Fed doesn't even have up and running yet to make it work. But the only way that gets paid back is with federal aid. Not all states will rely on this hope, though many could have a trigger where federal assistance could fill in some of the blanks. Once July 1st rolls around, that's only a month from now, of course, many of the worst case scenarios will have to roll out, and decisions have to be made before that. Nearly all state and local cuts translate into job losses, reductions in income from furlough days, or loss of services and financial aid to residents. And of course, this is just the state spending. Local cuts are already upon us with more to come. This could create a spiraling effect where less revenue means more cuts and then reduced purchasing power, leading to less revenue. This dynamic creates as much as $2 in economic losses for every dollar in cuts. Every dollar in cuts is $3 in economic losses then. And these decisions, which will be mostly locked in by July 1st. Illinois' machinations notwithstanding, in general, states and cities cannot leave budget deficits. Maybe every state figures out how to borrow and paper over the enormous hole. It's unlikely all of them will rely on wishes and hopes. Either Congress comes in with funding or the cuts go through. And Mitch McConnell is fiddling. Worse than Nancy Pelosi now. She at least had $1 trillion for the states in her relief bill. As the Wall Street Journal reports today, cuts from the Great Recession at the state and local level, which were callously neglected by Congress, led to drops in spending and employment that just got fully reversed last fall. That was in 2019. That's how long it took to catch up from the cuts from the Great Recession at the state level. Do we want to see that happen again? that this depression happens and the states don't catch up for another decade. I added that. That's not in the article. State and local government spending alone is 11% of GDP, responsible for over 12% of the U.S. workforce. These aren't far off cuts to this sector. Decisions will be made in the next month or so. There's no question that allowing them to go forward will lead to something approaching a depression combined with other losses. Therefore, Congress doesn't have time to see what will happen with the economy. If they don't backstop state and local spending, we will have a depression, period. Maybe it'll be a short depression or a protracted one where the lead weight of government spending cuts backs actually prevents recovery. But we will have one, and we have a few weeks to avert it. Take note, Donald Trump. If that happens, your recovery on steroids is never going to happen. If you can't get Mr. Moscow Mitch to turn around and give the states the bailout that is needed, then your presidency is done, done, done. No hope of having it come back. If we have the reopening and we have the deaths and we also have a depression, you're finished. Even if Joe Biden collapses into a heap of blithering idiocy, you still won't win. Take note, Jan Putz. Okay, there's more in that column. It's about the meat packers, and it's very good. But it's not on or towards or around the main point of this particular live stream. And that main point is that we're on the cusp of a depression. Not only on the cusp of further continuance of our tragedy, which is already baked in to the enormously stupid policies of the federal government, but in the midst of this continuing tragedy, with escalating death tolls, we are also likely to have a true depression as deep as the depression of the 1930s. Because this Congress is acting like Herbert Hoover, and this president is acting like Herbert Hoover as well, not understanding that prosperity comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. You can make the rich people richer and richer and richer. But when the economy collapses and Amazon stock collapses because the demand is not out there, and when the other big businesses suffer because there's no demand from the bottom, then it's all over. If there is no demand, there are no sales. If there are no sales, the stock market perishes. In the end, it perishes. You can manipulate it all you want. You can give all kinds of tax cuts to give it a shot in the arm. You can do more and more and more looting. But in the end, the fortunes of these people, the fortunes of the rich, are wrapped up in their investments. When their investments become worthless because there is no demand, Then you have a 1930s type of depression. Do you know how many wealthy fortunes perished during the 1930s? It wasn't only the stock market crash. Enormous stores of wealth were wiped out because there was no consumer demand during the 1930s. This economy, our economy, lives on consumer demand. And our leaders, our Congress, our president, because of their donors, won't do what they need to do to create that consumer demand and keep it strong. They won't do what they need to do, and they won't recognize reality, which is that not only will people stay home from the stores because they don't have any money, but they're also going to stay home from their jobs because when they have to make a choice between their lives, okay, or earning a living, what they're probably going to do is a little bit of both, which means a stop and start economy with an adequate demand that never gets out of the depression, that never escapes from the depression. So we the people, have to act. We have to find ways to bring those congressmen and senators around, to get them to recognize that their fate, if not in this coming election, then the election after that, that their fate and their fortunes are tied in with ours. They're not independent of ours. They cannot continue to oppress us and continue to do well. There is a limit, not only in terms of what we might eventually do to them if this doesn't stop, but in terms of what an economy that is failing to function will do to them. What will happen to Nancy Pelosi's real estate interests when there is no demand for housing in San Francisco because nobody can afford that housing? What's going to happen to hundreds of millions then? What's our San Francisco Bayside house going to be worth then? Has everybody already forgotten what the collapse of real estate values did to the real estate markets after the long recession of 2008, 2009? I mean, those real estate values collapsed in many places in the country by 40%, and that wasn't a great depression, as this one is shaping up to be. So we need to make very loud noises, and we need to find ways to general strike. We need to escalate the level of conflict and hostility and anger and rage until they understand that none of us can escape the conflagration unless they legislate for the people. Unless they legislate for the people to live and for the people to be prosperous while we are living. I will now go to your comments. And I thank you for being so patient. I think you have a lot of good ones today. I've been getting that impression. And by the way, thank you for sharing. Let me remind you of my YouTube channel and my Patreon link at patreon.com, Joe_Firestone. And now let me go directly to your comments. So, Stephanie says, hey guys, sorry I'm late, but I should be out of FB jail. Hopefully. Stephanie says, sharing my ass off. Stephanie says, Zoe, my sister. Avril says, yes, put knee on man's neck, and I think he was unconscious, and then the man died. Yes, that happened. And I understand that 4 of the policemen were fired. But now, what about charges? How about charges? How about charges? And Kay says, oh, new, but the protest was huge, but not violent at all. I was watching posts from there. And Steve says, it's a horrifying video. He was a civil rights lawyer, I believe, Kay said, Evelina. Avril Mano said, no. Lana says, Avril Mano investigation is imminent. The FBI is called in to assist. This happened within the last 24 hours. Oh, it's going to be an FBI case. It's a federal case. And Lana says, I can't watch the video. Too much. Avril says, thanks. I haven't been online, just scanned headlines here and there. I can't either. Steve says, I couldn't watch the whole video. It goes on a long time. Lana says, very sad story, Dr. Joe. Stephanie says, finally done sharing. Avril says, so much sadness and unnecessary loss. Stephanie says, so much hate. Avril says, we're so fortunate to be here tonight. We are. Russell says, hang in there, Joe. Avril says, hugs. Charles Brooks Lovett Jr. says, thank you for sharing, Dr. Joe. Thank you for being here, Charles. It's nice to see you. Steve says, too sad for words. Dale says, this is truly heartbreaking stuff. Avril says, now I'm crying. Stephanie says, I love you all so much. Dale says, me too, Avril. Avril says, back at you, sunshine. And Russell says, it makes the deaths very mensch. Sandy says, it's never easy losing people we love. No. Avril refers to neoliberal murderers. Charles says, I've been wanting to tell my doctor to get the hell out of the clinic she works at because she's a young and recently married, but she's still excited about treating people, poor people, and I don't. She had a lot of courage. Avril says, but they demand death for profit. Stephanie says, I love you, Dr. Joe. Thank you for doing this show. I really appreciate everyone here. Please believe that. I do too, Stephanie. I do too. I really appreciate everyone here too. Stephanie says, Arakel Bloss is a beast when she wants something done. I know. Stephanie says, Charles, oh my God, I've missed you. Steve Wolfburn said, it's a good group of people. We appreciate you as well. Thank you for sharing. Stephanie says, Charles Brooks Lovett Jr., I've missed you, stranger. Hope you're doing okay. Steve says, IDK, they did show up to a very unwelcoming crowd. Charles says, I missed you too and my progressive friends. So glad to see you still active. Activism. Avril says, I'm in the hospital, but Avril says, I'm in the hospital, but I spread MMT to the nurses while getting treated. Immune system attacked a nerve in my eyes. Listening and feeling every word because I'm still here. Avril, what have you got? I mean, I should say Carmen. What have you got? Stephanie tells Charles Brooks, Levitt Jr., not going anywhere anytime soon. There's still a revolution going on, right? Yeah, there still is. It's our revolution, whether he's with us or not. And you know who he is. And Dolores Pierce is here, and Charles Brooks Levitt says exactly. Stephanie says, Avril Mano sending healing vibes and healing love your way. Yes, Carmen, we are. Kay says, I saw the streets all around. The police station was full of people protesting peacefully. I'm thinking if it got violent, the police might have started the violence. Avril says, thank you. I appreciate that very much. I still don't have my coordination walking, and they mentioned releasing me tomorrow. I will not accept more neoliberalism. Stephanie says, Avril Mano, that's the spirit. You're strong and you got this. Yeah, neoliberalism. Sorry, I still got tubes in my hands. This is Carmen, by the way. Yeah, I know that. And Avril says, Stephanie Smith-Udy, thank you and thankful. Avril says, roommate let hold her phone. And Lana says, boy, that is a BS statement, Dr. Joe. Rare. Yeah, that was a BS statement, all right. God, rare. I think that Gautam is still hoping to get a degree from there, so he must say the required things. Avril says, most of the CARES money for the public is going to bills. I know. Everybody still has bills that are left over in one way or another from 2009, 2010. Lana says, yes, Bill Gates, who has his own agenda. Kay says, yes, I don't trust Gates either, Lana. John Sissy says, part of Putin's agenda is to breed apathy, make people feel the whole system is unredeemed. That is a lie. Vote for Biden. He can calm the country. Bullshit. This is bullshit. Bullshit. This has nothing to do with Putin. As for voting for Biden, I'll vote for Biden if he comes out with an agenda that merits my vote. And not just an agenda, but with a vice presidential candidate who merits my vote. Because we can't expect him to live through the first term, not the way he is now. We can't expect him to be a president for very long. His vice president is likely to become the president. So he needs a vice president who is going to speak to my agenda, to what I want to vote for. I don't owe Biden anything. He is the person who is running for office. He needs to persuade me to vote for him and others like me to vote for him. I am not breeding apathy. I am breeding activism, the kind of activism that will defeat neoliberals like Joe Biden, as well as criminals like Donald Trump. John Sisti. You can make a difference with your vote. We believe that we can make a difference with our vote, but we can also make a difference with general strikes. And we can also make a difference with continuous pressure on Congress. Lavrov says, don't just talk about the light bill, be the light. What use is all that money when you've lost your souls, your divine, your super consciousness? Steve says, Russia Gator, much. Kay says, no Biden for me unless he comes around to some of the progressive policies big time. No Biden for me either unless that happens. And Avril says, gee, I wish we had on the spot spell check. Avril says, right. And Kay says, the richer they are, the greedier they are in my experience. Evelina says, the Italian government is in the process of suing Mr. Gates right now. Avril says, man, I hope they win. Evelina says, they're still deliberating in Parliament. Kay says, Northeast Ohio broke a heat record today, 90 degrees. The other record of 87 was set in 1939. Climate change, not much. Green New Deal now. It was 85 here. And they said upon occasion that it felt like it was 95. 85 feels like 95. But we were out. We went shopping for food. Properly clad in our masks, okay, and gloves, and social distancing as much as we could, and we didn't feel too uncomfortable today. And Evelina says, Harris and Mnuchin are horrible persons. Avril says prophets. Avril says all world powers doing the same heartless things, punishing their brothers and sisters. Steve says COVID numbers in New York City finally looking better, thank God. Yes, thank God. Thank God. But they've still got a lot of work to do in New York City. They don't have enough testing. They don't have enough contact tracing. They don't have the kind of follow-up they have in other countries. Sandy Degg says, because they don't give shit about the people. And Kay says, I try to catch Pitchfork by Nick Hanauer, Hanauer, not sure the spelling, but a great podcast on Tuesdays. Yes. Now, Nick Hanauer is a patriotic billionaire. One of the few really patriotic billionaires, and one who knows a bit of MMT, and one who writes well, and who has always been on the forefront of warning the fat cats that they need to stop, and they need to pay more taxes, and they need to do a lot more for the people, for their own good, for their own good. And he's been serious about this, much more serious than Bill Gates. Alva says, would halting people's thirst for materialism put a dent into predatory neoliberalism? It probably would put a dent into it, but the only thing that's really going to put a dent into it is, I'm afraid, is really making it socially undesirable, unacceptable to be practicing predatory neoliberalism. You'd have to make a lot of it simply illegal, and you have to enforce the law against the people in these companies. If people are using robo-signing in order to foreclose on homes, they need to go to jail. That's the end of it. That's all. That's fraud. They need to go to jail. They need to go to jail for their frauds. They need to go to jail right now. Okay, they need to go to jail a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now. They need to go to jail, even if it's necessary to repeal the statute, okay, of limitations to put them in jail. because they deserve it. Avril says, this is primetime Dr. Joe. I'm happy that I'm able to see you tonight. Your teachings keep me in focus. Thank you, Avril. Catherine Takoshka says phone calls are starting to come, people using their stimulus check to file bankruptcy. Oh boy. Using their stimulus check to file for bankruptcy. That's another thing that Nancy Pelosi needs to do. She needs to bring back the bankruptcy protections. People need that right away. That's an emergency. They need to be able to declare bankruptcy for excessive credit card debt. They need that. Either that or the federal government needs to pay off the damn credit card debt. Steve Day says, austerity in healthcare. Private insurance is murder. Avril says, I don't want to bring children into this world. Okay, since I hear that, Avril, glad mine are all grown, but I have grands and great-grands that will have to deal with it all long after I'm gone. Sadly, most don't even have a clue what they're in for and won't listen to me. Our grandchildren are fairly well along now. One is a teen. She's an early teen. And the other is a preteen. The teen is pretty well aware of what is going on. I'm sure she's very well aware of certainly the Green New Deal and the need for a Green New Deal. I don't know how aware she is, of all the political issues, but I'll bet she's very serious when it comes to climate change and stuff like that. Avril says, did Nancy Pelosi even put hazard pay in the latest presents to the rich? She did put in some money for hazard pay in that bill. It was a comparatively small amount of money compared to the presents that she gave to the rich, but it was in there, and it would certainly be welcome for the essential workers. Steve Gonzo says, now rubber bullets are now being used. Steve, at the protest, crowd of thousands down to hundreds. This case says, I figured the cops started it. Steve says, it's okay, Doc. We're all pretty emotional. Stan says, it's an emotional time between the virus and the government. Okay, it's very depressing. I'm not depressed. I'm angry. Really angry. And really sorrowful. And that's really what we need right now. We don't need depression. They want us to be depressed. They don't want us to be angry. Kay says Wisconsin is a mess. Kay says it sure is depressing. And Avril says the Gilets jaunes are still fighting. They are. Steve says, we lost a member of my crew, died over the weekend from a heart attack. We can't even have a funeral or hug. We're devastated. I'm sorry to hear that, Steve. I'm very, very sorry to hear that. Kay says, Alabama is once again out of ICU beds and ventilators, and numbers are continuing to rise there. Oh, God. Avril says, and neoliberal rules and regulations via think tanks have unarmed we the people to fight against the tyranny in any way except the knowledge gave MMT. It is our only chance to infiltrate their bastion of hell planned for us. No, it's not our only chance. We also will have again access to the streets. Sooner or later, we will have access to the streets. Even if after millions of us have died, the rest of us will then be immune. And herd immunity will mean not only that we can go back to work, but that we can go back to the streets. Kay says, I'm expecting to be booted off the Medicaid program here in Ohio because of the state deficit. Uh-oh, that would be a tragedy, Kay. Sandy says, I think I will be laid off in July. Why do you think that, Sandy? Oh, because you're teaching in New Jersey, right? That's what it is. You're teaching in New Jersey. You don't know if the state will be able to afford it, okay, in July. Ivel says, Donald Trump wanted things back to the days of the 50s from the beginning. Donald Trump wants things back to the days of the early 1900s when the rich were having their way. He might even be looking back to the 1870s. And Russ says, I need to turn in again. I need to turn in and see you again soon. Yeah, thanks for coming, Russ. It's always good to see you. And Sandy says, have a good night, Russ, all. And Avril says, Gute Nacht, mein lieber Herr, which I think means, my dear sir. Isn't that what it means? Avril Mano says, because we'll survive, the rich don't know how to survive off the streets like we do. Let it be. Stephanie says, sorry, I had to run for a minute, but I'm back now. Kay says, I need these discussions to save my sanity. Laugh out loud. Thank you, Joe, and everyone else. Avril says, I can't even make a corny joke like usual. The unkosher bedbugs won't let me. Unkosher bedbugs. Unkosher bedbugs in the hospital? Steve says, police shooting more tear gas and marking rounds. Guy got nailed with marker from across the street. Truck drove full speed into a bunch of carts and protesters rushed it. The vehicle drove off, dragging a car down lake. More rain now and people dispersing. Sandy said, that killing was awful. Stephanie said, I'm glad we have each other. Stephanie said, if I don't get a chance, I want to say good night and I love you all. We love you too, Stephanie. I forgot the medical term because I'm still on meds. It's when your immune system attacks the myelin sheaths that cover the nerves and make the nerves malfunction. Oh, my God. Oh, that sounds bad. Stephanie said, we're all up in our feels tonight. It's perfectly acceptable for us to express our feelings. I'm glad everyone is comfortable about being open here. They really do care and appreciate everyone here. I was sorry, missed that comment all up. Stephanie says, amen, you tell him, Dr. Joe. Kay says, how come politicians now think we owe them a vote instead of working for our votes? God. And Kay says, this POS trailer is a damned hot box. Stephanie says, good night, my friends. Good night, Dr. Joe. Question mark. Have a good night, Stephanie. Good night, says Sandy, and Steve says, good night, Stephanie, and Stephanie says, good night, everyone. Good night, Dr. Joe, for doing the show. I love you all. I'll see you tomorrow. Great. See you too. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, for sharing, Stephanie. and Steve, and everybody who shared. Thank you for sharing. But Sandy and Dolores and Stephanie, thank you very much for sharing. And Kay says, I just saw a post about the protests in Wisconsin. When we're done here, I will have to watch. And Avril says, I think you're referring to Nancy Pelosi, meaning her heroes thing. Yeah, there was something, there was hazard pay, extra hazard pay in the Heroes Act. It was a very small part of the act. I think it was a $150 billion piece or something like that. It was a $3 trillion bill. $150 billion was going to the heroes. Okay. And so, of course, she entitled the whole act, the Heroes Act, for her lousy piece, her lousy 5% piece. But she named the whole act for that because she's an artist at misrepresenting what she's doing. She thinks that she's an artist, but she doesn't fool anyone anymore. Might have worked in the year 2000, but it doesn't work anymore. Kay says, sadly, I was in Southeast North Carolina where my grands were growing up in Ohio. When my grands were growing up in Ohio, their mother couldn't be bothered to bring them to visit much. Warren Chamberlain says, depression is anger turned inward. I know. Steve says, nearly all of the protesters, I always like to turn my anger outward. I guess I learned that at home. People in my family were not very often depressed. They gave free rein to expressing their anger in words. There was never any violence in my family. It was a very loving family. But when something bothered people, they didn't hesitate to say what it was and why they were bothered. There were some really outstanding fights, but in the end, everything was really good. Sandy says Donald wants to be king. Rick says no evidence to believe herd immunity will in fact work, just like questionable antibody treatment. And I think there is some evidence. I think that John Campbell believes that we will eventually get there, but he also believes it will take infection of at least 70% of the population first. Avril Romano says, you are correct. When a winner, chicken dinner. That's, I think, in reply to Troy Brown's comment. Narcissist Trump, he defies logic. You are correct. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. Avril says, thank you for your compassion. Because they made the masses desperate. He's the king of fools. Here's a live feed. I think that's a live feed to what's going on. Sandy says, Karn artist. Kay says, thank you, Steve. Avril says, appreciate your anger. Thank you, Avril. I think that's the last of the comments. And I thank you very much for coming tonight. I see my hour-and-a-half show has now stretched out to about 2 hours. It seems always to be 2 hours and a little more these days. But I love it, and thank you very much for being here. I love it when you're all here and commenting. And I'll be back tomorrow night at roughly 9 o'clock. Have a wonderful evening. And I'll see you then, hopefully. And please share, share, share. And don't forget my Patreon account. Thank you. Good night.